All right, everyone, we might get started now, being that it's 4 o'clock. I'm sure there'll be some later people to come in. Hello, friends. My name is Jason Imms. I'm the Head of Quality Assurance for Keywords Studios Australia. And my job is to head up the QA practice across all of our Australian studios, which includes Tantalus Media and its two recently announced new studios, Wicked Witch and Mighty Games. Today I'm here to talk to you about the actual value of implementing QA practices into your projects early. And the reason for that is because it isn't uncommon for QA practitioners to talk a really big game about the fact that you should do QA early, but then we often struggle to really define how or how to justify the extra cost. So that's what this is going to be about. And it should give you some concrete examples that you can start to make use of now, or at least start to trigger some thinking about how you might implement them. And I was writing a bio for something a while ago and realised that I've been working in software testing for more than 2 decades, which thank you, I guess a whoop is appropriate. But it does basically make me a dusty old skeleton. But it was that a woo or a boo? Thank you. It's kind of positive both ways, isn't it? But at least it does give me a little bit of authority, hopefully, to be able to talk about what some good QA practice can look like, and I'll hopefully give you some insights into how you can build QA practice into a broader spectrum of project types and modes of work that will suit your context. I should note that the terminology and methodologies I'm going to talk about today are based on my experience over those many years. It isn't a specific overview of how Keywords does things. It isn't a specific overview of how Keywords outsourcing and functional QA does things. This is just supposed to be a quick 30-minute encapsulation of a bunch of ideas to get the ball rolling for you. I've worked in both games and enterprise software in that time, which I'm actually really proud of. I think as a quick aside, there's an icky bit of almost shame people feel if they don't land a games job and have to take a job outside of games. Like, oh, I failed somehow. And I think that sucks. I actually think it makes you a much more hireable employee if opportunities come up. And the job market right now is pretty wild. So if you've got extra experience, it's a good thing. And you'll learn some kind of best practices that have been developed in, frankly, more established, longer term, more rigorous parts of the world. Anyway, back to the history lesson to establish a basis for this. After I worked in enterprise software for a very long time, I found myself with a very strange opportunity, one of those annoying right place, right time stories, so I won't go into detail, to get some work as a games journalist. So I was working in enterprise software, got this games opportunity and started building a network. So I worked as a freelance writer for tested.com, a bunch of other places, but for Tested I was doing tech explainers and how-to guides and long-form pieces on consumer electronics, but then moved on to writing about games with a bunch of publications, and there's some logos there, but I was trying to have a really broad range of publications to build as big and strong a network as possible, because that creates opportunities. All told, I did that for about 5 years and built up a network that I was really pleased to have. But I also have 5 kids and a mortgage, so being a journalist wasn't really conducive to my needs. So I had the opportunity to move into the industry side and merge my 2 career paths together. So I was approached by some well-known game studio owners who pitched the idea of us setting up a QA consultancy together, specifically to serve Australian studios. But we ended up working with people overseas as well. They were going to be our first customers, and then we'd grow things from there. The machine was my baby. And I've told this story here before, so sorry for repeating it, but I feel like it helps. And often this is the bit people ask a lot of questions about afterwards. So we built the machine to help clients confidently make their best games, and I think we did that. It was a really amazing ride, and we worked on some really wonderful titles that I'm still kind of pinching myself about. Some of the highlights were helping the wonderful League of Geeks with their first move into mobile on Imello, We also helped them establish some great new processes for their internal team and really elevate them amongst that kind of internal community. We worked really closely with Love Shack Entertainment and Horse Drawn Games to bring the framed collection to Switch, which was a really fun challenge. I even had the privilege of working with Clay Entertainment on Mark of the Ninja Remastered for Switch, alongside Plastic Fern Studios, who are a great outsourcing crew if you're looking for some. I also consulted to a bunch of other studios on building QA processes that would serve them long into the future, and I had a heap of fun, and we did some really great work, but it couldn't last. There were a lot of factors that contributed to us shutting down the machine, largely some external circumstances that we just had no control over. But at the end of the day, my business partners and I came to the conclusion that we just couldn't sustain the machine with the rate of work that we were able to win in Australia at the rates that game studios could afford to pay in 2018. We didn't know that going in. Probably should have done, arguably, but we didn't. It seemed, and arguably still seems, that game makers and studio owners around the world often hold what sometimes feels like an almost willful blindness to what it actually costs to make games for market, to be active, viable, and vital members of an industry, not just a game-making community, right? They lowball contractors, they underpay staff, they underpay themselves. They don't take the time to develop and improve process. They just kind of limp from milestone to milestone. Proactive training and accreditation, strengthening teams, growing people and mentoring, especially emerging practitioners, beyond what they can learn from experience on the job or from taking opportunities to come to events like this to learn. 2018 was a long time ago, and things have changed heaps since then. We have ostensibly federal government investment on the horizon. There's a huge amount of international investment happening right now in studios and individuals in the region. We've got multiple Australian studios growing rapidly, landing amazing deals with publishers, going public, for better or worse. It's a very, very exciting time. Have we solved all these problems that I mentioned? Absolutely not. But that isn't really the point. The point is that we're now in a much stronger position to be able to do better, to be less drastically reliant on opportunity. And today, you're here to learn about how you could do better at applying QA to your projects much earlier than people tend to, and to gain an understanding of the value that QA can bring to your projects beyond simply finding and filing bugs. So, obviously, first and foremost, finding and filing bugs. It's pretty important, and you all know this. I know that's not why you're here today, but if I don't put it on the list, I will get called out for it, probably by these three. The next one, and I think this is a really important one, is increased confidence for your stakeholders and decision makers. I'll get into this in more detail later, but you don't get this confidence just because we've been finding and filing bugs, but because there's been a bunch of reporting that QA can do to describe how much of the product has been covered, which features have produced the most bugs, which features have proven the most brittle over time and prone to failure into the future, and overall impressions of the current health of the build. And you will receive confident, informed decision-making opportunities, which I think is really powerful, and it's a huge value that QA can add. A lens through which others view their completed work. I really love this one. I have a whole slide on it later, so I'm not going to get into detail now, but it's on the list for the sake of completion. Risk documentation and elucidation. It's really just an excuse to say elucidation at a conference. Risk management is commonly misunderstood, and it's a really big piece of value that QA can bring to the table. And it's one of the most powerful drivers of change that QA practitioners can wield, because it's the lens through which we can describe why we suggest a change. And often QA people don't get the chance to suggest changes because stay in your lane, right? I feel like QA staff should be trained to frame as much as possible in the terms of acceptable risk. The publisher wants us to add a feature at the last minute. If we prioritise that feature, other labour will have to give. Are we willing to accept that risk, or should we propose moving the dates around? And if we agree that the risk is acceptable, then we do it. No one has to do overtime because we've all agreed. It really is powerful. Stewards of done. I feel like I need like a house crest for this. Speaking of confidence, QA's job is not to gatekeep work. It's to constantly validate that work is being completed to agreed upon standards. It's a kind of semantic argument, but I think it's a really important distinction. Because it sucks for any contributor to a project to not 100% know for certain that they did everything that they were expected to do, what they were asked to do when they marked a task as done. QA can be here to help validate the doneness of that work, to ensure that totally natural human error is protected against, meaning that if we've signed off on a piece of work being done, then you can move on knowing that it's done, not stressing for weeks, what if I forgot something? And practice improvements for all disciplines. This is cool, I think, because good QA practices that affect, good QA practice affects the work of all other disciplines. QA can actually be a really fantastic conduit for encouraging improvements to everyone's way of working, because we are involved in everyone's work. It's generally one of the more structured and workflow-heavy disciplines, meaning that we can define really clear and demonstrable inputs for our work and then show others how their outputs might change a bit and make our lives easier, thereby making their lives easier. All right, we've only got 40 minutes, so this is a glossary of terms that I'm going to use during this talk, but I'm not going to define them in detail. They're there. If you want to take a photo of it, do it now. I'm going to hit a button, and then some numbers are going to appear, and then it's going to go away. This is your chance. Can't go back now. Do you know how long that took? Forever. All right, there's a handful of different modes of operation for a games project. So again, these are my terms, these aren't formal terms. This isn't a conversation about how QA explicitly fits into like an agile practice, but if you want to talk to me about that later, I'll talk your ear off for hours. So there's a handful of different modes of operation for games projects, in my opinion, based on a whole bunch of different factors. And I think these are the most common ones. This is like an unholy amalgamation of project type and project state that describe how a QA team communicates with itself about how to engage work and deliver value. So we'll start with Greenfields. Greenfields projects can be anything. It's really, really early, and it's very much subject to change. It's often some kind of new IP or a prototype or similar, and it's little more than a loose collection of ideas that may or may not coalesce into a product, into a game. From a QA standpoint, Greenfields projects can be risky because they generally don't have finished features for us to test that are well documented and ready for test. Many people will tell you that it's not worth testing a project that's in this stage, but I'm here to tell you that they're incorrect. It's a really common refrain amongst QA practitioners that you should include QA early, but it's really hard to put a number against that. It's really difficult to describe the value of that in dollar terms. It's really difficult to make a business case for the expenditure over and above what would normally be expected to budget for QA on a project. But here's the thing, QA is way, way, way more than just testing. It's always better and it's always cheaper to avoid bugs than it is to find them and fix them. Lots of nods. A Greenfields project is any project that does not have a clear or detailed understanding of what it's going to be yet. Maybe you've delivered a pitch to a publisher and they really love your concept, so they greenlight the development of a prototype. You've got some concept art, you've got some paragraphs in a pitch document somewhere, you've got an ideas person who will just talk your ear off, but everything's still really nebulous. Nothing's concrete, and your team's just throwing ideas around and is tasked with like wireframing things, placeholder art, character rigs, etc. Nothing about this project is done. So how can a QA person look at a feature and claim that it's finished? Is it okay to file a bug against a feature that's objectively not finished? The long answer is yes, but it's complicated. And in short, no, you can't, because it'd be silly to file a bug against an an unfinished feature. But what we can do requires a bit of a shift of thinking. It's to validate the completion of work as it makes its way through the project. You're not validating completed features. All you're doing is validating that the agreed upon work for this time box, for this period of time, has been completed as agreed. None of these features are finished, but the work has been broken down, ideally, into achievable chunks, so that you should be able to validate each of those chunks individually as done. Here's an example. A developer's put together a new player movement system. It's very early, it's definitely not final, but it's done enough for the current sprint, so it's ready to support prototyping for other associated features. QA's job is to look at what that work entailed, what it added to the product, and confirm that what was supposed to have been achieved has in fact been achieved. We're not hunting for bugs. We're just validating the team's effort toward achieving its current goal. We want to help the team do its best work. Sometimes that involves what we call, or what we kind of made up, is feature handovers. So when on a larger or higher risk piece of work, but it's too early or unfinished to be functionally tested in detail, or maybe it isn't tested, you can't test it with a controller, you can't really get hands-on with it, but it's still a piece of work that's been finished. All we do is ask whoever worked on it to book literally a 5-minute call with a QA analyst to show them what they did. Just have a second pair of eyes on it. This isn't code review, this is showing me the change that you made. And that's all it takes. I reckon vastly more often than not, I don't have a graph for you, but in my experience, vastly more often than not, the developer will be going through the change and they say, I made a change in a database and I went to column X and I just realized I forgot something. Tap, tap, tap. Make a quick change, fix it, and move on. And suddenly some unknowable number of bugs didn't make it into the product just because they were thinking differently about the work that they just completed. And back in my journo days, this was a really common thing that we called reframing. You finish up a story, you do a pass over it, find errors, you paste it into your email client or the CMS, and you send it off, and as soon as you hit send, you notice a bunch of mistakes. And it's really common. Most people, I think, experience that. And the reason you can see them after you hit send is because you're looking at the article or the email or whatever it is in a different context. Your email client instead of a Word document or whatever. So we reframe this work. We can do it. There's a few different tricks we can use. Some people simply resize their Word viewport so that the text rearranges to fit. Some will print it out and go over it with a pen. You can sit down on a different device in a different room at a different time of day. I used to sit down with all yesterday's articles on my iPad in an armchair with a coffee and not at my desk. Just trying to reframe it as much as possible. And it really does make a huge difference. And I think this feature handover concept really fits that. We can also act as an independent voice, helping other members of the team to consider the work that they're doing and the decisions that they're making by simply asking questions. This is kind of the fluffiest part of the job. It's the hardest to quantify by a long shot, but I think it's really powerful. Have you thought about how this feature will interact with this other feature that we were talking about yesterday? This feature may cause us to have problems when we're going through cert. Maybe we can head some of those off of the pass while we're designing it. How many concurrent players should we expect this feature to safely support? Questions help people get out of ruts in their thinking, and I think QA is well placed to be player advocates and see how the features all fit together and they flow together in the playing. And I firmly believe that people are much more likely to learn from their mistakes if they're given the opportunity to find them for themselves. We're reducing the total defect surface, or the risk surface, of the game by heading off bugs at the pass, and by making it less likely that similar mistakes will get made in the future. It's a double whammy. Prevention is definitely better than a cure. This one's a little more self-explanatory. the rubber's really hit the road, and we're well on our way to having a finished game. At this point, the goals are clear, and what we're trying to make has been solidified, and features are being completed and deployed into builds. Now we're moving into a more traditional kind of enterprise QA structure of functional testing and acceptance testing. It's shocking to me how few games QA practitioners understand the difference between these two things, despite the fact they do it all the time. They just don't create a distinction between the two, and you get a lot of value from doing so. During functional testing, we're not only validating the completion of work, we're now bug hunting and comparing features to builds to sources of truth, to documentation that tells us how things should be, as well as looking at how features fit together to make the game that our players want to play. So as features are completed and they make their way through your workboard or whatever it is you use, and they're marked as ready for QA, the QA team can throw a bunch of functional testing time and functional testing techniques at those features to confirm that they do what they're supposed to do and that they don't do what they shouldn't. Often we just do the positive pass and make sure it does what it is supposed to do, and we don't think about the other. Functional testing deeply probes a feature with a view to finding and filing as many bugs as possible. It doesn't really care so much about how different features fit together, unless you're explicitly doing that kind of integration testing. It's more about getting down into the nitty-gritty details of each individual feature and seeing how they work and to expose the most severe bugs. Now, during full production, we also perform acceptance testing at various points. It's somewhat project dependent when you do it, but the trigger is usually when a build needs to be sent elsewhere in some way, whether it's released, shown to stakeholders in a demo, handed over to another team for review, anything. Somewhat counterintuitively, acceptance testing is not really concerned with finding bugs. Obviously, if we find some, we'll fire them. But what it's designed to do is validate whether or not the product in its current state is fit for purpose, which is a really important phrase. And if you're taking notes, write that one down. It doesn't deeply assess a feature. It looks at how features fit together and whether the product is fit for purpose after the inclusion of newly introduced features. How users of different types make their way through the product and interact with a gameplay loop. At the end of an acceptance testing pass, we'll often file a build health report, which is called a million different names in a million different businesses. But it's designed to describe what testing was planned, what testing was actually executed, because they're often different things for various reasons, any known bugs that are still present from the functional testing passes, how the testing was undertaken, and importantly, a conclusion, a paragraph that asserts QA's position on whether or not a build under test was fit for purpose. Is this build fit to be given to the client? Are we confident of that? If we fix these three things, we think you can be confident. It isn't our job to make the decision. That's probably a producer's job or a product manager's job, but we can inform them so they can make a good decision. And hopefully you can imagine the difference that it makes to them. Basically, any decision maker to have a report that says it is okay, you can press that big green release button and start planning the launch party. Or more likely, you can press the big green launch button, but we'd suggest you fix these three critical bugs first. You can see from this helpful diagram how functional testing and acceptance testing differ at a very high level. Acceptance testing moves across a lot of features but doesn't go into a lot of depth. Functional testing is the opposite. Functional testing is very siloed and looks at features independently. And acceptance testing is shallow, doesn't look deeply. And I think the combination of the two is really powerful. And again, I think you're probably already doing some of it, but if you don't understand the distinction, you're losing a lot of that value. Content delivery phase. All right, so think about ongoing or live service games. In that context, QA's role changes significantly. How do we provide value to a project that is no longer shipping new features, it's just putting more and more content in? Many live service games or ongoing content games become about shipping new content to players within existing feature frameworks. So the game isn't changing mechanically anymore, but we still need to ensure that it's meeting our quality goals. We can work with art and narrative teams to help validate the completion of their work, like we talked about before. And for games with ongoing content drops, seasonal events, etc., delivering content is a really incredible amount of labour. And the creation of content is often a very linear process. Assets are started by one person or team and make their way through other teams until they're finalised and put into the product. Writers write scripts, narrative designers integrate scripts with a narrative engine, artists create assets, animators and riggers do their arcane magic, and eventually all of that content makes it into the game. QA can work within these intra-sprint, almost waterfall-y procedures to validate done to varying levels of detail, or we can wait right to the end and do it when it's integrated into the product. But I think the things we've talked about today about doing QA early, starting earlier in the process, they don't just apply to a whole project. I think they apply to the processes within the project as well. So I think if we can get in earlier on this stuff, on the content stuff, it makes a big difference as well. I should note that QA on ongoing content games can be really grueling because it's hyper repetitive. So I definitely recommend setting up a good, if you have the privilege to do so, a good personnel rotation process at your studio to move people in and out of content delivery projects, to look after their mental health, and to make sure that they're being stimulated and learning stuff on other projects. And I should note on a positive note that projects in content delivery can actually be really good onboarding opportunities for new staff. They can come in, they can get used to the processes in an environment where the pressure isn't super high and their risk isn't super high because there's probably not many bugs left. And they can learn a heap from that before they move on to something else. Launch and CQA. All right, this wrinkles my brain. This is where most studios start QA. They wait until the game's largely finished and most of the features have been marked as done or integrated, and only then do they begin seeing what bugs are present. Can you see what's wrong with this approach? Like, at this point, the game's undergone huge amounts of change. The features that were finalised first have sat largely idle, while new features have been layered on top. Bugs that were present since the early production stages, and I absolutely guarantee you there are bugs in there, those bugs have been there the entire time, festering away. People have been developing habits of looking through them and around them and learning how to ignore them because we're not ready to fix them yet. And they say things like, we know, we'll sort it. Has someone filed it as a bug? No, I've got it in a notebook. Or I'll remember, don't worry about it. The notebook thing drives me crazy. Pre-certification testing, what we should be doing at this point is finalising leftover functional and acceptance testing, doing some regression testing on our first-time user experience and tutorialization, doing final full product acceptance tests, and preparing for certification testing. Not starting testing. This is the end of the project and we should be doing end of project activities. Pre-cert testing, or CQA, certification quality assurance, I guess, is the process of running all the same certification tests that platform holders will run when you submit your game. The three major console providers, as most of you know, have really comprehensive prescriptive test cases that allow them to ensure that your title meets the requirements for being made available to customers in their marketplaces. Those test cases are available to you. They're in most of the developer portals and they're kept up to date, so you can run those tests internally before you submit to increase your chances of making it through first try, or realistically probably second try. There are endless stories about studios that get stuck in limbo, submitting over and over and over and over again to certification as bugs fixing bugs found in previous attempts. Sometimes those fixes introduce brand new bugs that fail them out on the next run. So you can see how a studio's cash flow can be really seriously threatened by this portion of the project. And also, your staff are probably tired and burnt out and panicking about a date they may or may not hit. So you really don't want to be one of those studios. Obviously, if you want to get these tests and run them yourselves, plan for it and do it. You can do your CQA in-house before you submit so that you can submit with confidence. Incidentally, CQA is a really fantastic candidate for outsourcing because it is super specific and it doesn't require people outside your studio to have lots of pre-existing knowledge. they're running the same tests all the time and just plugging in a different project. You can come and find me later, or anytime this week really, if you'd like to know more, and I'll put you in touch with people who use the right terms. All right, so your launch date is fast approaching. And before that, you need to submit and hopefully pass cert. If you're only really starting to test in earnest at this point in your project's life cycle, what's going to happen is, it's a question, what is going to happen to all of the bugs that you're going to find? They'll be logged, and then people can start working on them now, at the end, when you're fast approaching your delivery milestones. How long will it take to fix? Depends. How long will it take to verify the fixes? Who knows? How many can you fix between now and that hard milestone date? No idea. By starting early and catching problems before they're committed to code, validating features as they're being added to the product, and developing excellent processes around how bugs are documented and managed to completion, when you get to this portion of the project, things are much safer and you've mitigated a gargantuan amount of risk. If there's only one take-home from this talk for you, I want it to be this. If your budget doesn't allow you to start your QA practice earlier than at the end of the project, then you're inherently accepting that you will ship bugs to market, or you'll delay your release. You're arguably choosing this future for yourself. I understand that different studios have different amounts of money, different levels of privilege, different levels of experience. I get it. And we can't all be aware of our blind spots. And that's why you've shown up here, to learn more, right? We don't have infinite money. Sometimes you can only make the best choices that you can make within your constraints. That's fine. All that I ask is that now that you have a head full of information about how to apply QA to your project early or earlier, and have a feel for the value that it brings, please do what you can to bring those expectations into your budgets for future projects, if not the current one. Please help create career pathways for QA practitioners within your studio, because the tertiary educators tend not to. Please work with local tertiary educators, actually, if you can, to help provide this kind of reality-based QA education, industry-based QA education into future course structures. Encourage them to do better on that stuff. Now, I'm not a big quotes guy, especially quotes originating from the military, but I really like this one. Quality is never an accident. It's always a result of high intention, sincere effort, intelligent direction, and skillful execution. It represents the wise choice of many alternatives, the cumulative experience of many masters of craftsmanship. Also, quality marks the search for an ideal after necessity has been satisfied and mere usefulness achieved. Thank you very much, and if people would like questions, I'm right here. To the mic. Thank you. I left ages for questions this time because I think last time I did a talk at GCAP, I left about 5 minutes and people were a bit grumpy with me. So if you've got a question, please come up to the mic, queue up, and let's go. Hi.
Hey, thanks for the talk. So in regards to QA being part of acceptance and feature approval, I was wondering about your experience and best practices regarding the process and the agency that you give QA in terms of like feature specifications, design specifications, and yeah, the level of like involvement QA gets in terms of having that high level of ability to approve those things essentially on behalf of other departments.
Hell yeah, what a great question. That's awesome. Yeah, agency for QA earlier in the process on like static assets like documentation and things. Yeah, awesome. Often people don't have, there's often not a lot of static assets and documentation that form that source of truth. And so the first bit of agency that I'd like to give QA staff is to make that really clear. Make that really clear to your teams. Say, we need a source of truth. We're going to have one whether you like it or not. And if it's not in a document, it's you. We're going to ask you lots of questions and we need you to answer them so that we can do our jobs. And if, and I hope you do, you respect us as equally valid members of the creation of this game, then please do us the benefit of that respect. Yeah. Ideally, it's a document. And at that point, you can do lots of static testing, which we did not cover in this talk. Static testing is the validation of static assets, anything that isn't code, basically. So we can go over a document and we can start documenting questions about what do you mean by this? This is a bit ambiguous. This is very subjective. What do you mean it should be fast? Like, can we have some more information? Document those questions, document a bunch of assumptions, and that's a huge wealth of knowledge, or a huge wealth of opportunities for designers, say, to start thinking a little bit more critically about stuff that they glossed over or went quick on. Giving QA staff agency to do that is challenging, right? Because you need to make sure that they've been given the time to do it. But it's just a matter of educating the decision makers there on the value of doing the work. And again, that's frankly the hardest part. It's a big part of the job. Yeah. Does that help? Cool. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for the talk. I had a question. So yeah, I think that you can probably relate to this too, right? Like one of the craziest things that, you know, I can sometimes rub up on friction with is that like obviously like quality is like everybody's job, right? Like it's not like you can't be just like QA being a downstream process, right? You can't be like expecting to introduce upstream defects and not suffer the consequences of downstream failure. And so
I should have that quote in the talk. That was awesome.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. So it kind of stands to reason, right? Like, and you know, so like, you know, given that like when any new work begins, right, and this is upstream, developers are working on new features. You know, what kind of responsibility, risk management, or quality practices that you can place on engineers to prevent major defects and provide evidence of implemented behavior, such that when you start to receive that work downstream, not only are you aware of the changes that are being made and you understand the specification, that kind of thing, but also there's a reasonable expectation that, you know, you're not just going to be calling out like fire the whole time.
Yeah. Awesome question. Far out. Thank you. That's wonderful. So I really like the idea of a culture of quality is something that a studio should try and implement, right?
Yeah.
It's like you said, it's everyone's responsibility. Everyone should be trying to do their best work. And often due to constraints and time pressures and other things, we can't, or we're less likely to be able to. So the practices we can put in place to make those things more applicable and more likely are things like having a definition of done, or a definition of when you can safely move a piece of work from one state to another, right? A definition of ready for test. A good example of that is, if this piece of work is actually as done as you say it is, then I should be able to see it in the build that's currently available to me. And if that's not true, it's not ready, and I can push it back. And definition of done, same thing. What are the entry requirements for the doneness of this piece of work? And there's a whole suite of things there that QA can immediately start validating for you. But ideally, you've done those validations yourself. So it becomes a social agreement that you will validate the doneness of this to at least the bare minimum of that definition of done bullet point list. And then we can jump in and get our work done without having to go back and argue and all those things. I had another thought, which was a good one, and it's gone. Damn it. Dang. If it comes to me, I'll get back to you.
Yeah, all good.
Dang it. It was a good one. Let's go to this question, and I'll come back.
I was wondering if you had any insights or experience with developing QA processes unique between QA and very particular departments. So creating maybe a unique reporting system between the QA and the LD team versus the QA and the art team, because they all work differently.
Yep.
So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, cool. Oh, wow, another great one. I like giving people responsibility for some of that. So if you have the privilege of a larger team, then having one person be the communication point between QA and the owner of the process between QA and art, or the process between QA and two disciplines, and they own that relationship, I think that gives them a lot of agency and a lot of ability to kind of grow their own role and grow their own expressions of value to the rest of the team. Specific processes, I think it's just really early for games to be thinking, like they don't think about this very much, generally speaking. Most studios don't think in detail about these things. So for art, it's a matter of going to the team and saying, we want to start doing some QA work on your work, and we don't want to slow you down. We're not interested in slowing you down. We're not interested in gatekeeping the completion of the work. We want you to be confident that you're finished. That's all. So how might we do that? And have those kind of how might we conversations. How might we get involved earlier in your pipeline and start validating some things so that when we get to implementation of those pieces of content, that they're ready and the testing is really quick and the bugs are low. So I think it starts in conversation, and then contextually is different for every project. Yeah. And put it in Jira or something. Like, use a tool. Build the process in a tool rather than relying on social knowledge. Yeah.
Thanks.
No worries. I remembered the thing real quick. 1 sec.
Yeah, go ahead.
Estimations is another place that you can make a big difference. Often QA is left out of the estimations process altogether. How long will it take to implement this feature? X amount of time. It could take ages to test it though, because it's on 7 different SKUs, and your enthusiastic gesture is really good, and I'm very happy. Thank you. I'm really enjoying it. I feel very validated. They're often not involved, and often like it's really quick and easy to test something, but it's a real pain in the ass to implement it. Like those two things don't go hand in hand. So what I'd like to suggest is make estimation a team exercise, get everyone involved in it, because it's often done early in a project, and then you expect those estimates to be right for 2 years. Whereas you want to be kind of estimating each piece of work as you're starting to assess it. And if you can make it a team activity, then you can start to elevate everyone's understanding of everyone else's work.
Because I had a follow-up question about involving QA in the design process at the start.
Cool. I want to get to that one. Can I get you to jump on behind this gentleman here, and we'll do it in the microphone so that it goes in the recording. Is that cool? Yeah, awesome.
Cool. Thank you for the talk, Jason.
No worries.
Do you have any guidance on a good amount of time to spend on QA relative to the overall project budget?
No.
Or does it depend?
No, like a lot of business, like back in the old days of waterfall and stuff, you would, like a third of your programming budget you can justify for QA. It doesn't work, like that's not universal. So not really, it's very project dependent, and like a really simple web application is quite simple to test. And a video game is a nightmare, comparatively. So not really, unfortunately, it's not very helpful. But you can get some kind of independent assessments done, right? You could reach out to someone you know to be experienced, pay them for an hour of their time to go over some things and just give you some gut feelings, even just some like t-shirt sizes on different features. And that will give you an indication of, that will help me think a little bit more in detail about how I should structure the budget for QA.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no worries. All right, your design question.
This guy can go.
Okay, sure. Hi.
Sure. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on like automated testing, automated functional testing, and how that kind of integrates and interacts with QA in general?
All right, I'm going to try and answer that as a question as opposed to an entire talk. That's a big topic. Unit testing is a really valuable piece of work that programming teams and engineering teams can take upon themselves to do. It's a big upfront cost. Unit testing, for those who don't know, is was that 10? Thank you. Unit testing, for those that don't know, is tests that are built into the code of the game that validate a bunch of stuff before it ever gets to a build. And then there's post-build. There's a million different terms for this. Like post-build automation. Things like Mighty Games test bots, fellow Keywords company. They do post-build automation, which is a bot or a tool that sits on top of the game after it's been built, and then does automation through the input layer. So it's actually sending inputs in the same way that a player sends inputs. Both of those things are hyper valuable, but very expensive to implement. I think the world where the bots are coming for our jobs, I think that's a big pile of crap. Because when you've got automation and humans doing the work, the humans don't have to do the stuff that they're bad at and the stuff that they find boring. The robots can do that. And they can be focused on the stuff that humans are better at finding and find more enjoyable to find and feel like they have more agency in their work. So automation's amazing if you can make it work. It's just a very specialized skill set. So if you've got the knowledge to get it done, then go for it. Otherwise, feel free to come and have a chat about Mighty Games.
Cool, fair enough.
No worries. Hello again.
Hello again. Yes, yeah, good to see you. So my question was, it was more about if you could just speak on the topic of maybe involving the QA earlier on in the process, specifically the design process too, when we're talking about like defining behavior such that, down the line when you are testing it, there is not only some bit of context, but they've also been involved in like, you know, like there's been times when, you know, you might just be given like a test case or something like that. And given that the written language is a particularly like low bandwidth form of communication, could you speak to the effect of involving QA in the design from the start, and maybe some of the benefits that comes with that?
Sure. That's a tough one because it requires a lot of trust.
Of course,
and so it's trust that you have to, the QA team needs to build.
Sounds like relationships.
Yeah, it is. And I have a whole, in the training I tend to run internally, I have a whole kind of section on trust and social responsibility within a team and being above reproach. Not to be like hyper moral and ethical, but to make sure that the team trusts your judgment in most things. Right? And when they trust you, when you're that integral, being involved in design is much easier. And again, it's usually just asking questions for QA because we're there to find opportunities to validate. We're not there to do the design work necessarily. We can ask questions like, I have a good example was Framed. The original version of Framed that I worked on, it was originally an iPad game, so it was all touch inputs, and then inputting it to Switch, they had to design a controller scheme as well. And originally there was a setting in the options where you could toggle between the two. And after I'd been working with the team for a while and built up some trust, I had the courage to say, what if we merged the two so that players could just smoothly move between the two, move a box around with the controls, tap and drag it when it feels natural to do so. And initially the team were very against it because it was a lot more work. But because they trusted me and we had that relationship, they were able to take it on board, and eventually we implemented it. And I'm really proud of that feature. I think it made a big difference, but it does take time to build that relationship.
Yes, yeah. I think it was building on some of the stuff I heard yesterday about embedded QA in teams, and like obviously like the benefits that come with that closer like collaborative culture, less like throw over the wall stuff and, you know, deal with it later, or not my problem.
Yep.
That's like QA's problem.
Yeah.
And sort of like I guess understanding the acceptance criteria behind pieces of work, maybe not necessarily throwing the 2 cents in for design, but also like, you know, the shared perspective. Obviously, like, you know, we're all humans with imperfect knowledge at any given point in time. So yeah, I just wondered if you'd had, you know, much of that, I guess, experience with the, I guess, closer integrated cross-functional type teams.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it usually comes with time. And in my career, I often was moving between lots of projects, especially as a consultant. So having the time to build up that relationship was a little challenging. But usually it's just a matter of helping people understand how their work affects ours. And that's true for any discipline on any project. But I might move on to the next person. Just because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Sorry, guys. Cheers.
Hi.
Hey. So I had a new guy start in my QA team recently, and he asked me the other week, what can I do to become a better QA? And I didn't have a particularly great answer for him because my experience has always just been learn by doing. So I was wondering if you had any resources or any suggestions about, you know, what people can do to become better at that role.
Yeah, go get a certification. There's heaps of them. They're usually enterprise focused, but there's a wonderful foundation called the ISTQB, the International Testing and Standards Qualifications Board, which have a whole bunch of like globally recognized certifications that you can go and get that will serve you in any job that you get in that field. And they go from foundational and really simple and light to incredibly detailed. Automation is a whole pathway. Test-driven development is a whole pathway. There's heaps of knowledge to gain there. And I would say for any studio with money, I'm noticing your hoodie, it's a worthwhile investment because it makes them professionals. And maybe they'll stay in QA long term rather than bouncing off to other disciplines.
Awesome, thank you.
No worries.
Hi, good
Hi.
talk, by the way.
Thank you.
At the risk of sounding a little naive, do you have any pointers or tips for QAing for like online multiplayer or like network games or anything like that in particular?
Oh, my gut is screaming at me to say, don't make those.
Oh, I try telling other people, but I'm locked in now. It's too late.
That's fine. People, you need more people, right? You can't, trying to do that as an individual is damn near impossible. So how are you going to make that work? If you can't budget for more than one QA person on your project, I'm not saying that that's true. I have no idea. If you
We've got
can't,
0 QA people right
hell
now.
yeah. Then budget for one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you can start thinking about how you can get extra people involved. Is it that we budget for bringing more people in over time? Could be. Is it that we create a relationship with some trusted community members who can come in and get some kind of benefit from it? Ideally, you pay them. It's not a privilege that every studio has, but you don't want them working for free. So find some kind of way that they can be paid for their time. But you're going to need extra sets of hands on that thing. And ideally, if it's multiplayer at any kind of scale, you really want to be bringing in a large series of people to do some work for you. So looking at companies like Keywords to come and do some consulting for you.
Cool. Thank you very much.
No worries. We're technically out of time. Can I do one more or not? Right. I have to go to the keynote because I'm doing it, but we can do one more real quick one.
I'll be quick. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm very new to all this, so I've been taking a lot of notes. And just from what I'm learning, I'm wondering, are QA ever seen by other departments as overstepping or micromanaging? And if so, like, how do you deal with that boundary setting and role setting?
Ooh, that's a really heavy one to end on. Good call. Yeah, I have, and it sucks, right? Like, that's a cultural problem.
Okay.
That screams of some larger cultural issues. I have no insight into your organisation, but...
Well, I'm not from an organization. It's just from doing programming and thinking about working with, like, I think that's, to me, it feels kind of unclear.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, look, my first ever QA job, the QA team literally sat in the server room. That's where our desks were. It was cold and loud in there. We were physically removed from the rest of the team, and our job was to poke holes in other people's work. That's how we were treated, and that's how I understood it. That's all I knew, and it was awful. It was dehumanizing. It was really, really, really unpleasant. As soon as that business, like, we whinged enough that all they changed was they moved us out of the server room into the rest of the space with everyone else, and we had our desks interspersed around the team, not all clumped together. We became physically a part of the team, and then emotionally part of the team over time. So simple little changes like that are founded in the question, are you treating your QA people as vital and valuable members of the project? Or are they expendable?
That's really good advice.
Cool, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I really need to go. Cheers.